you look at the kind of a lot of the lakes in Ontario and Quebec, there's actually evidence of ancient earthquakes that have happened in the region. So we get an idea that seismicity here is not like a new thing. It's been going on for quite some time.
When we think of earthquakes in Canada, most of us think of the high magnitude earthquakes that happen on the west coast in British Columbia along the Cascadia subduction zone. However, approximately 450 earthquakes occur in eastern Canada each year, and the people living there don't even know the extent of this risk. So why is eastern Canada underrepresented when it comes to earthquake risk awareness in Canada?
You got to take it back to the actual geoscience and the reasons why earthquakes occur in these different regions of Canada and why they're different. If we think about the West Coast, which is where we're always talking about seismic hazards and the big one and all of this, it's a plate boundary. Yeah, lots of powerful processes going on, and people are always thinking about, like, as I said, when the big one's going to happen. Whereas in Eastern Canada, we're actually talking about something completely different. It's called intraplate seismicity. And this is when we are sort of stressing the continent at its edges and pushing and squeezing on it. And we're actually reactivating faults that already exist in the middle of the continent. And I think it's that difference between sort of plate boundary and also the intraplate processes that kind of feeds into why it's a little bit underrepresented.
Earthquakes are often measured using the moment magnitude scale, which measures that energy released by an earthquake from 1 to 10. Each step in magnitude is approximately 30 times the amount of energy as the previous step. This means that an earthquake of magnitude 2 releases 30 times the energy as a magnitude 1 earthquake, and a magnitude 3 earthquake releases 900 times the energy of a magnitude 1. However, magnitude alone doesn't necessarily determine the destructive capabilities of an earthquake, which is often what we as people care about: the resilience of the communities we build and the lives of those we love. Given their lower magnitude nature, why is it important for Canada, and especially Eastern Canadians, to pay attention to intraplate earthquakes?
Yes, intraplate earthquakes are kind of still can actually be quite substantial magnitudes, up to about 5 or 6, which is still capable of causing quite substantial damage. And also, if we look offshore Newfoundland, and it's on the Grand Banks, the historical earthquake in 1929, that's a magnitude 7.2 earthquake, which, that's a pretty big earthquake for something which is supposed to be far from plate boundaries. I think we should still pay attention to them because they're still capable of producing damaging earthquakes. And that earthquake actually produced a tsunami as well.
The proximity of the earthquake to a population center, how shallow in the earth it occurs, and the secondary effects such as tsunamis, contamination of water supplies, gas leaks, power outages, landslides, and fires are all factors that go into the devastation this natural disaster can bring. Although intraplate earthquakes are typically lower magnitudes, the risk in Eastern Canada has more to do with vulnerability. What's the most important thing Eastern Canadians should know about earthquake risk and safety?
I think it's to know that things can happen here. Cities like Vancouver are fundamentally at a higher risk of bigger earthquakes. But just because they're at a higher risk of big earthquakes, it doesn't mean that Eastern Canada is at no risk of earthquakes. And I think that's the problem we have, is we think we're at no risk, but we're not at no risk. We're just at a lower risk compared to an exceptionally high risk region. Fundamentally, what I would like to tell people is you don't need to panic, just be aware that they live in an earthquake-prone region.
These earthquake-prone regions of Eastern Canada are divided based on clusters of earthquake activities. Considering the various zones that exist on the eastern side of Canada, our population is vulnerable to earthquake impacts due to our unpreparedness as a society. This is where eastQUAKE comes in. The primary purpose of eastQUAKE is to first and foremost raise awareness of earthquake vulnerability in Eastern Canada. Seismic hazard maps compare the relative hazard of all of Canada, so Eastern Canada will always seem low hazard compared to the West Coast. However, we know from historical earthquakes that large magnitude and damaging earthquakes can happen, and will inevitably happen again. To tackle this issue from two angles, eastQUAKE has developed two web apps, eastQUAKE's Near You and eastQUAKE Vulnerability. eastQUAKE's Near You is a tool that shows Eastern Canadians their proximity to earthquakes in order to raise awareness of past and future earthquake risk. eastQUAKE Vulnerability implemented a multi-criteria decision analysis that takes into account social, environmental, and physical factors to display earthquake vulnerability based on characteristics of a city itself. Starting with the city of Hamilton, Ontario as an example, we want to quantify earthquake risk so that Hamiltonians, and ultimately all Eastern Canadians, can be prepared well ahead of anything that might happen. Earthquakes are unpredictable, and knowing that your region is earthquake-prone is the first step. Western Canadians are taught earthquake safety from a young age, and for good reason. But eastQUAKE wants every Eastern Canadian located in a seismic hazard zone to know the exact course of action to take when one hits. We have to be prepared in advance.
Welcome to eastQUAKE's collection page. Here you can explore our 3-story maps about the history and background about earthquakes in Eastern Canada, the purpose of eastQUAKE, 2 of our eastQUAKE apps, and our emergency preparedness guide. Let's get started. Here are the following tabs you'll be able to explore on the following page. We'll begin our tour with the very first story map. You'll get a chance to learn about Canada's general history about earthquakes. We've highlighted the timeline of the most historic Canadian earthquake events. These have been noted either because they were the very first to ever be detected or have been recorded with high magnitudes. Then you'll know more about Eastern Canada's largest documented loss of life due to an earthquake in Newfoundland Grand Banks. Then towards the bottom, you'll be able to explore the sites of historical earthquake events in Eastern Canada through our web map. Our second tab is at the Interplayed Earthquakes page. The main idea here is to get familiar with the earthquake seismic hazard zones in Eastern Canada. Using the map tour, we've made it easier for you to visualize where these zones are located, as it takes you from one zone to another as you scroll through. To know more about the fundamentals behind earthquakes in Eastern Canada, you would need to know more about these troublemakers here, interplayed earthquakes, and why we should care about this natural disaster. Our third tab discusses the purpose behind eastQUAKE, and it introduces the 2 applications that Team McDisaster will be releasing, eastQUAKE Near You and eastQUAKE Vulnerability. After you've obtained all the information that you need to be aware, now it's time to prepare. This page gives you the steps for the before, during, and after event of an earthquake.
Welcome to eastQUAKE's Near You. The purpose of this first web app is to show Eastern Canadians where earthquakes have happened near them through various interactive tools. The user is welcomed by a splash page where they are prompted to click the I button to learn more about the features of eastQUAKE's Near You. Here, the user learns more about the purpose of the web app and what kinds of earthquakes are the most dangerous. They are prompted to click this button here to learn more information about the magnitude scale. The 3 main features of the app are then explained to the user, as well as which layers are featured on the map. The layers shown are all earthquakes in Eastern Canada from the year 1600 to 2019. The marker icons show 10 major Eastern Canadian cities. The population density of each Canadian census tract is also displayed, so the user can visualize the proximity of earthquakes to population centers. The first tool we will explore is Earthquakes Near Me. Eastern Canadians are often unaware that they live in a seismically active zone where earthquakes have and will happen again. This feature allows users to define a buffer radius around any Eastern Canadian address to view which earthquakes event have happened near them. The user is prompted to enter their address, enable their current location, or drop a pin to locate earthquakes near them. The default search radius is 50 kilometers, and the user can scroll the bar to increase or decrease from 1 kilometer to 100 kilometers. Once the buffer is set, users can see all of the earthquakes within the set radius, including the time and date they happened, their magnitude, and a description of the place. This tool is meant for Eastern Canadians to realize whether or not they live near an area where an earthquake has occurred. The next feature is Major Cities. This tool displays 10 major Eastern Canadian cities that, when clicked, automatically takes users to their chosen city. This allows the user to easily navigate to some of the most populous cities in Eastern Canada to explore the nearby earthquakes. The third and final feature is Filter by Magnitude. Users can use this tool to filter the magnitudes of earthquakes that they would like to view. They are prompted to specify a range of magnitudes between 2.5 and 7.2, and when the filter is applied, it will only show the user magnitudes within that range. This tool is useful for users who want to filter out lower magnitude earthquakes and learn where high seismic events have happened in Eastern Canada. The filter can then be turned off with the bottom button when the user is done. This concludes the demo for Earthquakes Near Me. The final demo is on the eastQUAKE Vulnerability app.
Welcome to eastQUAKE's Vulnerability. The purpose of the second web app is to communicate risk factors associated with vulnerability to earthquakes to promote sustainable communities. A multi-criteria decision analysis, MCDA, was conducted to determine the top 10 most vulnerable areas in Hamilton, as well as rank the vulnerability of each Hamilton census tract. The user is once again welcomed by a splash page, where they're prompted to click the I button to learn more about the features of eastQUAKE's vulnerability. Here are the features that this app offers: Top 10 Earthquake Vulnerable Zones, Search your address, explore the multi-decision criteria factors, and what's displayed on the map. Click on the Earthquake Vulnerability Factors button to learn more about which factors went into the calculation of earthquake vulnerability. The top 10 most earthquake vulnerable zones. This feature helps the user pinpoint and navigate through the top 10 most earthquake vulnerable zones in Hamilton identified through the MCDA. The darkest purple represents rank 1, most vulnerable, and the lightest purple showing rank 10, least vulnerable compared to the other parts of Hamilton, but the least out of the top 10. Here are the MCDA census tracts with regards to the factors discussed above that go into play with regards to the sustainable communities. The dark red depicts Hamilton's most vulnerable census tracts, and the lighter red depicts the least vulnerable zones. The tool includes each zone from 1 to 10, clickable for the user with the corresponding zone's color. The user will then be taken directly to the zone of their choosing, where they can then click on the zone and receive a summary of the earthquake vulnerability. It characterizes the type of community that this zone is located at. In this case, for Zone 1, it's found within a residential area near Lime Ridge, and the type of population that lives here are families and the elderly, and this area is most at risk. We have also included all these factors using the Layers tab, so you can have a look at the MCDA factors throughout Hamilton. You're able to turn on and off different social, environmental, and physical factors and sites that you might be interested in looking at and their associated vulnerable zones. Users can explore the criteria that went into calculating the vulnerability of Hamilton to earthquakes. One of the other really cool things we have on here is the ability to search your address or any location in Hamilton. So you can view which level of vulnerability that exists within your community, and this way you can find out if you live in one of the top 10 most vulnerable zones.
eastQUAKE, making you aware so you can prepare. Thank you for listening.